In the fall of 1823, the quiet farming village of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, recorded something deeply unsettling: 17 unexplained deaths in only 3 months. What alarmed townsfolk most wasn't the number, but the chilling fact that every single one of the dead had been prepared for burial by the same funeral home. That business was the Hartwell Funeral Parlor, a family-run establishment that had served Millbrook for over 20 years. The Hartwells had long been admired for their gentle handling of the deceased and their kindness toward grieving family. But when a traveling doctor happened to notice strange markings on several corpses during a routine inspection, he uncovered a secret that would rattle the foundations of this seemingly peaceful town. What investigators later found beneath the Hartwell Funeral Home's basement was so disturbing that officials sealed the records for nearly a century. Some whisper that the full story still hasn't come to light. Before we continue with the tale of the Hartwell family and their sinister enterprise, if you're fascinated by dark mysteries buried in America's past, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We bring you haunting true stories you won't hear anywhere else. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our worldwide community of mystery seekers. Now, let's return to Pennsylvania, 1823, where the Hartwell family built what looked like a respectable business. On a foundation of unimaginable horror, Millbrook was a tiny settlement of about 300 people, tucked into the rolling hills of southeastern Pennsylvania. Locals lived by farming, lumber work, and the occasional travelers who stopped at the town's lone inn. While the United States as a whole was moving into an era of growth and progress, small towns like Millbrook remained isolated, far removed from the bustling energy of Philadelphia or Pittsburgh. Here, everyone knew their neighbors. Children roamed freely, and trust was the glue that held the community together. The Hartwells had first arrived in 1801, when Ezekiel Hartwell, the family patriarch, bought a large stone house on the edge of town and opened the region's first dedicated funeral parlor. Before his arrival, families usually handled burials themselves, or relied on the town carpenter to make coffins. At first, locals looked at Ezekiel's professional approach with suspicion, but his dignified manner and fair prices quickly won him over. He lived in the home with his wife, Martha, their children, Josiah, Caleb, and Rebecca, along with Martha's aging father, Thomas Creed. By appearances, the Hartwells embodied everything respectable about rural Pennsylvania. They were devout churchgoers, joined in barn raisings, and Martha was known for bringing food and pies to struggling families. Their eldest son, Josiah, aged 26, had mastered the embalming trade under his father and was expected to inherit the business. Caleb, 23, built coffins and dug graves. Rebecca, only 19, worked beside her mother, comforting grieving families with her gentle, quiet nature. The funeral parlor itself was a 3-story stone building with a wooden wing added on for preparation rooms. The main floor doubled as living quarters and the viewing room for services. Upstairs were the family's bedrooms. Below, in the shadowy basement, was the embalming and storage area. A nearby barn was used for coffin making, and the Hartwells even maintained a small burial ground for those who couldn't afford plots elsewhere. What earned them even greater trust was their willingness to serve families regardless of money. In years of crop failure or harsh winters, they often accepted food or future labor instead of payment. This generosity bound the Hartwells to dozens of families across the region, and word of their kindness spread to neighboring towns. By 1823, nearly every death within a 15-mile radius passed through their hands. The wider world of Pennsylvania in 1823 was also changing. The Erie Canal in nearby New York was nearing completion, promising new trade and opportunity, but also threatening small-town ways of life. Meanwhile, waves of religious revivals were sweeping through rural communities, appending traditional order, and stirring social tensions in that shifting landscape. Institutions like the Hartwell Funeral Parlor represented stabilities, something people could cling to. But beneath that polished reputation, a darker truth was forming. The nature of their work, their isolation, and the absolute trust of grieving families created opportunities most could never imagine. For the Hartwells, death became more than a profession, it became an obsession. And soon the line between preparing the dead and creating them was crossed. The first sign came on October 15th, 1823, when Dr. Samuel Harrison, a traveling physician for the state, arrived in Millbrook. His duty was routine, inspecting townships for disease, ensuring safe water and food storage, and checking burial practices. What caught his attention was not the number of recent deaths, but the unusual details he noticed during his required inspection of the Hartwell parlor. Pennsylvania law demanded that bodies remain available for medical examination if requested, a regulation established after deadly cholera outbreaks a decade earlier. When Dr. Harrison arrived at the Hartwell establishment that crisp autumn morning, he was greeted warmly by Ezekiel Hartwell and his son, Josiah, aware that what lay below their home would soon unravel one of the darkest chapters in Millbrook's history. The Hartwell brothers welcomed Dr. Harrison into their establishment with an air of professional pride, showing off polished embalming instruments and spotless preparation rooms. On the surface, nothing seemed amiss. But when Harrison asked to personally examine 3 bodies awaiting burial, the facade began to crack. The first was Eleonora Fairchild, a 68-year-old widow said to have died of consumption only 3 days prior. At first glance, her condition fit the accountant till Harrison's eye caught faint discolorations just under the collar of her burial dress. The bruises, almost hidden, bore the telltale pattern of strangulation, not the wasting illness that supposedly carried her away. When pressed, Josiah Hartwell explained that such marks must have come from an awkward position during the embalming process, insisting they were post-mortem blemishes. His reasoning sounded possible, but his quivering voice and refusal to meet Harrison's gaze told another story. The second body belonged to Marcus Webb, a vigorous farmer of 42, whose death had been attributed to a sudden heart attack in his fields. Yet Harrison discovered small, deliberate puncture marks on Webb's arms and chest. These were no random injuries. They looked intentional, precise. When questioned, Ezekiel Hartwell claimed Webb had collapsed onto sharp farming tools, but the wounds were far too neat to match such an accident. The third corpse unsettled Harrison most of all. Mary Patterson, only 26 and mother of 2, had supposedly perished from a raging fever. But near her lips and beneath her fingernails lingered a fine white residue. Harrison's training left no doubt was arsenic, a poison widely used to kill rats, but far deadlier in human hands. As the physician quietly recorded his findings, the very air in the Hartwell home grew heavy. The family, once cordial, now watched him with sharp, measuring eyes. Martha Hartwell, emerging from the kitchen, stood in the doorway with a smile that seemed more predatory than kind. Even young Rebecca, who had earlier seemed guileless, regarded him with a knowing gaze far beyond her years. In the cellar, where bodies were prepared, Harrison pressed for a closer look. What he found was worse. Still glass vessels lined against a wall, each containing chemical mixtures and, disturbingly, preserved human organs. Ezekiel explained these were for study, to better understand the illnesses afflicting their clients. Yet the organs were fresh, carved with unnecessary precision. Then came the leather-bound journal, half concealed beneath burial cloth. Harrison glimpsed its pages before Caleb Hartwell swiftly stepped between, claiming it contained private family records. But in that fleeting look, Harrison saw notes cataloging townsfolk tales of their health, their households, even their financial standings. By the end of his visit, Harrison faced a grave dilemma. His training screamed that foul play surrounded these deaths, yet all his evidence was circumstantial. The Hartwells were long-trusted pillars of Millbrook. Few would accept accusations against them from an outsider. That evening at the Millbrook Inn, Harrison drafted his report only to be quietly approached by townspeople who had caught word of his inspection. Their whispered accounts painted a chilling pattern. Vigorous men and women struck by sudden decline, deaths that followed brief illnesses, and the uncanny swiftness with which the Hartwells offered their services. One tale in particular shook him. Sarah Petton, who had lost her mother just weeks earlier, confided that her mother had been hearty and lively until Martha Hartwell began frequent visits, bringing soup during what was little more than joint stiffness. Within 3 days of these visits, the elder woman fell violently ill and died before a physician could intervene. The Hartwells immediately took charge of the burial, even waiving their fee as though out of kindness. Harrison soon realized his discoveries fit into a larger, more sinister history. Whispers of unease about the Hartwells were not new, they had simply been ignored. The family had arrived in Millbrook from Western Virginia in 1801, saying Ezekiel had learned mortuary work from an uncle in Richmond. They bought their property, with gold coins, surprising abundance for people who claimed modest means. That very winter, a so-called wasting sickness swept through town, killing 8 residents, all laid to rest by the Hartwells' newly founded parlor. over the pews. Neighbors had remarked always to Leighton how swiftly the health of loved ones failed once the Hartwells inserted themselves, how insistently the family managed every detail, discouraging second opinions or delays in burial. But in a community, their generosity and courtesy masked suspicion. Murmurs were dismissed as grief's imaginings. Now, in the autumn of 1823, Dr. Harrison realized those murmurs had been warnings ignored, and Millbrook was paying the price. The cellar beneath the Hartwell establishment concealed horrors that, if known, would have shattered the town's trust in them forever. Hidden behind a cleverly constructed false wall, one that had escaped. Dr. Harrison's earlier scrutiny lay what could only be described as a chamber of death. Pall-lined upon the shelves were bottles of deadly toxins, surgical instruments far too advanced for any ordinary embalming work, and elaborate anatomical sketches that hinted at experiments extending well beyond the respectful treatment of the dead. The most incriminating discovery, however, was a complete version of the journal Dr. Harrison had once glimpsed. Bound in worn leather, this book contained painstaking records of every death that had passed through the Hartwell's care. Written in several hands over the years, the entries revealed a chillingly methodical study of murder, documenting not only the techniques used, but also the deliberate selection of victims. The family had developed a ruthless understanding of their neighbors, preying on those unlikely to invite deep investigation. The elderly with few kin, the ailing, and those who had slipped into poverty. Their crimes were spaced carefully, ensuring that no suspicious pattern would ever alarm the community. One entry in Josiah Hartwell's neat handwriting described, with unnerving precision, the fate of Marcus Webb. Webb, a widower without close family, had been targeted both for his isolation and for the convenient location of his farm adjoining Hartwell property. Lured to the funeral home under the guise of coffin arrangements for a neighbor, he was subdued and subjected to what the journal delicately referred to as procedures before his life was ended. His death was staged to resemble a sudden heart attack. The family's motives appeared tangled, part greed, part grim curiosity, and part perverse fascination with death itself. Valuables were routinely stolen from victims, but the true obsession seemed to be the act of killing and observing it. Pages of the journal recorded experiments with poisons, detailed notes on how different victims reacted to terror and agony, and a ceaseless drive to perfect methods that left no obvious trace of murder. Martha Hartwell emerged as the most cunning of them all. Outwardly a kind matron, she specialized in cultivating trust among lonely or frail townsfolk, eventually slipping poison into food or drink she had so generously offered. Her reputation for warmth and charity made her the perfect predator. Even the children were woven into the family's darkness. Rebecca, innocent in appearance, proved skilled at spotting vulnerable townsfolk at gatherings, passing her observations to the others. The sons handled the physical violence, learning how to subdue victims and disguise the deaths as natural. The Betsy's greatest strength lay in their flawless integration into community life. They sat in church pews, participated in civic pittings, and shared tables with many of the very people they were plotting against. This dual existence demanded a terrifying ability to separate their murderous impulses from their social roles, suggesting either deep-seated psychopathy or a gradual descent into shared madness. By the fall of 1823, their activities had escalated. A bitter winter had left many neighbors financially ruined, more susceptible to the Hartwells' offers of help. Their long success at escaping suspicion had emboldened them, and so the pace of their killings increased. At last, Dr. Harrison's examinations began to raise questions. The physician found himself caught in a perilous bind. His medical inspections left no doubt that foul play was occurring. Yet to bring his findings to the authorities meant accusing one of Millbrook's most respected families of serial murder, a charge so outrageous that few would believe it. And with his scheduled tour of neighboring towns approaching, Harrison risked either abandoning his duty or inviting suspicion upon himself by delaying. The turning point came unexpectedly. On his second evening in town, an old man sought him out, Martha Hartwell's father, Thomas Creed, claiming severe stomach pains. He requested a private consultation away from the funeral home. They met in the stable behind the inn. Once alone, Creed shed the guise of a feeble patient. His eyes, sharp with fear and cunning, fixed on Harrison. "Doctor," he whispered, glancing anxiously toward the street, "I know what you've seen. The marks, the poison, the wounds that don't fit their explanations. Your suspicions are right, but the truth goes deeper than you realize." In that hidden meeting, Creed laid bare a history even darker than Harrison had guessed. He confessed that his own kin had been poisoning him for months, using him as a living experiment. His advanced age had made him the perfect subject, but his survival instincts and knowledge of their methods had allowed him to resist their attempts. According to Creed, the family's descent into depravity had begun not with murder, but with grave robbing. Soon after settling in Millbrook, Ezekiel Hartwell had discovered that fresh graves yielded jewelry, gold teeth, and fine clothing that could be resold in distant towns. What began as theft of the dead had evolved, step by step, into the systematic killing of the living. The Hartwell family's descent into darkness had not been immediate but gradual, born from small crimes that evolved into calculated murder. Their first true step into bloodshed occurred in 1807, when a robbery of a sickly man ended with his death. Instead of risking exposure, they masked the killing as the natural course of his illness and, to their surprise, the ruse worked flawlessly. That single deception emboldened them. From then on, they refined their methods, each family member cultivating a distinct role in their grim enterprise. Creed revealed that beneath the funeral parlor lay a hidden chamber, a workshop of death containing ledgers that chronicled more than 40 murders committed over 16 years. Victims had been carefully chosen, strangers, travelers, and lonely figures whose absence would scarcely raise suspicions. Informants from nearby towns helped the family identify targets, ensuring a steady supply of victims. What lent weight to Creed's testimony was the precision of his knowledge. He described in chilling detail how Eleanor Fairchild had been strangled, how Marcus Webb endured torment before his death, and how Mary Patterson was slowly poisoned under the guise of being nursed by Martha Hartwell. He also disclosed the location of a mass grave concealed in the woods, where those whose deaths could not be disguised were discarded. Among the bones were the remains of wanderers who had stopped at the funeral home for aid, never to be seen again. Creed's reasons for betrayal were as much survival as conscience. The old man had grown sickened by the family's brutality, but more pressing was his awareness that his own end was near. They no longer valued him, speaking openly of using him as a final test subject. His only chance of escape was to expose them. Thus, he offered Dr. Harrison both a truth and a plan. During the family's absence at Sunday service, Harrison would use a small, ornate key to access the concealed laboratory. There he could collect the records, drawings, poisons, and most damning of all, a map of the burial ground. Meanwhile, Creed would vanish, making his absence appear like the confused wandering of old age. All night, Dr. Harrison wrestled with the enormity of what he had learned. The crimes were monstrous, the evidence damning, but the consequences of revelation would devastate the trust of an entire town. Worse still, he knew the Hartwells suspected him already. Creed had warned that the family killed without hesitation, to guard their secrets. When Sunday dawned bleak and bitter, Harrison stationed himself in the woods behind the Hartwell property, his nerves taut with dread. Soon the family emerged, impeccably dressed for church. Ezekiel in his black suit looked more a minister than a murderer, while Martha, in a sober blue dress, radiated matronly dignity. Josiah and Caleb followed as dutiful sons, and Rebecca her delicate, innocent appearance, belying the cunning Creed had described, walked close to her mother. What unsettled Harrison most was their facade of normalcy, smiling at neighbors, greeting children. They played the part of a God-fearing household. Yet beneath this veneer lay a legacy of murder spanning decades, hidden behind the doors of their respectable home. The doctor lingered outside for a full half-hour after the Hartwell family had gone before daring to approach their funeral home. In the pale light of late autumn, the stone building looked more like a fortress than a place of mourning's walls, heavy with secrets that, if uncovered, would rattle the entire town. Dr. Harrison's fingers shook slightly as he slipped Thomas Creed's key into the basement door. Yet years of medical training had hardened him to unsettling sights, and he forced himself to remain deliberate and calm. At first glance, the cellar matched exactly what he had seen during his formal inspection. Everything appeared orderly, embalming, tables polished, jars of chemical solutions neatly arranged, and the few bodies entrusted to their care lying still beneath spotless white sheets. But as he pressed closer to the walls, Harrison uncovered what Creed had hinted at, a concealed entrance. A section of stone that looked no different from the rest swung open with the small key. exposing a hidden chamber more dreadful than anything he had imagined. The space stretched wider than the main basement, running beneath the house and into the hillside beyond. Along every wall stood shelves crowded with glass vessels, each one preserving fragments of human anatomy, catalogued with dates and cryptic notes. In the very center sat a heavy lectern, supporting a thick leather-bound volume. This was no ordinary book. It was a record of murder, maintained with the precision of a scientist's log. Harrison's medical eye quickly grasped the meaning of the entries. Victims were listed with care, followed by the method of approach, the manner of death, observations on their final reactions, and suggestions for improvement. The earliest notes described crude poisonings, but later pages revealed refined techniques, sharpened through years of practice. Recent sections grew far darker surgical experiments, apparently carried out on living subjects to measure the results. What chilled Harrison most was the revelation that these crimes were not confined to Millbrook. The ledger detailed killings in at least 6 other Pennsylvania townships, each connected to the family's travels as undertakers. They had developed a careful method for spotting vulnerable people in distant communities, only to return months later and strike where suspicion was unlikely to fall. The illustrations scattered throughout the book were worse than the words. Detailed anatomical sketches charted the stages of their procedures, noting which methods drew the most terror and which dispatched victims most efficiently. To the Hartwells, their prey were not human beings at all, but specimens for macabre research. So absorbed was Harrison in documenting these horrors that he lost all sense of time. When he finally glanced at his watch, nearly 2 hours had passed. Voices drifted in from outside, familiar voices. With dread he recognized the slow, deliberate cadence of Ezekiel Hartwell. The family was home from church far earlier than expected. Panic surged. He could not slip out through the basement door without walking straight into them. But if he lingered in the hidden chamber, discovery was inevitable. They would kill him rather than risk exposure. Footsteps thudded on the porch above his head. His heart pounded as he realized he had only moments to act, desperately scanning the chamber. He noticed something he had missed before. Behind a clutter of glass jars at the far end of the room stood another door, leading deeper into the hillside. With no other choice, he hurried toward it, praying it led to safety rather than further horror. The narrow tunnel carved into the rock bore the marks of years of expansion with hand tools. Carrying a single candle, Harrison pressed forward until it opened into a vast cavern. What he found there froze his blood. A subterranean charnel house. Bones and corpses littered the cave. Some were carefully arranged on shelves carved from the stone, others thrown carelessly into heaps. The stench was suffocating, yet Harrison forced himself to examine the scene with clinical detachment. He counted the remains of at least 40 people, victims spanning decades. Many showed the same experimental mutilations described in the ledger. Others had been dispatched with ruthless efficiency. Scattered among the dead were personal effects rings, clothing, coins proof that robbery had always been a part of the Hartwells' grisly trade. What had begun as suspicion had now unfolded into undeniable evidence. Decades of systematic murder, carried out with chilling discipline, hidden beneath the very house that the community trusted most. The most horrifying discovery lay in one section of the cavern where the most recent victims had been arranged almost like grotesque trophies. Among the garments and trinkets, Dr. Harrison recognized items belonging to individuals he had previously examined during his official duties. This left no doubt that the Hartwells had not merely prepared the dead, they had been manufacturing them. The clinical precision of the display suggested that the family returned to this hidden chamber frequently, whether to indulge in grim to remembrance or to further their dreadful experiments. As the physician carefully recorded his findings, faint voices drifted through the tunnels. The Hartwells had realized his absence from the inn and uncovered evidence of his intrusion. They were calling his name, but their voices carried no warmth or concern. They echoed like the deliberate calls of hunters closing in on prey. Fortunately, the cave system had more than one outlet. Dr. Harrison forced himself through a narrow passage that opened onto the wooded slope above the Hartwell property. From that vantage point, he watched the family move across the grounds in coordinated formation, searching with the ease of people well practiced in such pursuits. It became clear to him that he was not the first to stumble upon their secrets, though. Others, it seemed, had not escaped. His flight from Millbrook demanded every ounce of his survival knowledge, and no small measure of luck. Abandoning his possessions at the inn, he trekked across country instead of following roads, certain the Hartwells would have eyes along the main routes. In his medical satchel he carried enough evidence to convince officials, but only if he could reach a safe jurisdiction before his pursuers silenced him forever. Unknown to him, Thomas Creed had not managed his own escape. The old man was intercepted when he tried to flee the Hartwell home. His family quickly realized his betrayal. Under merciless torture, Creed confessed everything. His alliance with Dr. Harrison, the physician's plan to collect proof, and their intent to expose the enterprise. This admission explained why the family had returned from church so abruptly that day and launched their pursuit. Worse still, it convinced them that their tenure in Millbrook was over. Instead of killing Harrison and resuming their work, the Hartwells decided to erase their tracks and move their operations elsewhere. They told the townsfolk that Ezekiel had received word of a dying relative in Ohio, and that the family would need to depart at once, perhaps for months. They closed the funeral home and asked neighbors to watch the property in their absence. The excuse seemed entirely believable, and the townspeople offered sympathy rather than suspicion. Behind the facade, the Hartwells were obliterating their past. The hidden chamber was stripped bare and sealed. The tunnels partially collapsed to conceal the remains within, and every incriminating document either burned or packed for transport. By the time Dr. Harrison reached Philadelphia 3 days later, the family was already gone, leaving only an abandoned parlor and a town oblivious to the horrors it had harbored. Harrison's testimony met with disbelief. Officials in Philadelphia struggled to accept that a family so respected could maintain such a monstrous trade undetected. Though his evidence was compelling, most of it had been destroyed or hidden. Investigators recovered only a few bones from the collapsed cave fire, too little to support the magnitude of Harrison's claims. The people of Millbrook, unwilling to tarnish the memory of their trusted neighbors, provided glowing character references. With no family members available for questioning, and with so little tangible evidence, the authorities ruled the matter unproven and filed it away. As for Thomas Creed, the Hartwells dismissed his disappearance as the sad wandering of a senile man lost in the woods. Search parties turned up nothing, and the official record left his fate a mystery. But Harrison never doubted that the old man had paid for his betrayal with his life. The revelations tormented both the physician and the tout for years, though Harrison submitted meticulous reports to the state. The case was eventually labeled inconclusive and consigned to bureaucratic obscurity. He did not relent. Using his own funds, he followed trails of suspicious deaths across the Midwest, in Ohio, then Indiana, Illinois, and even the Missouri frontier. He identified patterns of disappearances that mirrored Millbrook's, yet each time he alerted authorities, the Hartwells had already vanished, leaving only whispers and graves behind. Millbrook, meanwhile, lived in uneasy denial. Some residents clung to Harrison's account, convinced they had unknowingly harbored a dynasty of murderers. Others rejected the idea entirely, insisting the Hartwells had been nothing more than generous neighbors falsely accused. The truth, however, remained buried with the victims, scattered across states in the wake of a family who perfected the art of vanishing. Residents of Millbrook soon began to question past burials with uneasy suspicion, wondering how many of their loved ones had been deliberately killed rather than taken by illness or age. The Hartwell funeral parlor itself stood deserted for nearly 2 years before a Philadelphia merchant bought it and converted it into a general store. Even then, townsfolk were reluctant to step inside, and it took years before the business was truly accepted. The basement was permanently sealed off, and no one dared investigate the underground passages that Dr. Harrison had once described. Yet the greatest wound left by the Hartwell affair was not the building, but the change it forced upon the town. The trust that had bound Millbrook together for generations dissolved into suspicion. Death, once endured with solemn faith, became a source of dread. Neighbors eyed one another warily, and the close-knit community slowly fractured. Dr. Harrison resumed his travels as a physician, but his work was forever altered by what he had witnessed. He developed an almost obsessive scrutiny in his examinations, treating every death as if it concealed a crime. Colleagues whispered that he had grown paranoid, but Harrison knew too well that evil could thrive behind the most respected faces. In 1847, nearly a quarter-century after the Millbrook events, Harrison received a letter that confirmed his fears. It came from a sheriff in the Oregon Territory, where settlers had recently exposed a family of undertakers named Caldwell. The sheriff had recognized familiar patterns, mysterious deaths, hidden burials, and a trail of poisonings and after consulting Harrison's earlier reports in federal files, realized that the Caldwells were none other than the Hartwells, under assumed names. For more than 20 years, the family had moved steadily westward, building new identities and continuing their bloody enterprise. When captured, they admitted to murders spanning nearly 3 decades across 8 different states, with a victim count exceeding 120 souls, placing them among the most prolific killers in American history. Ezekiel Hartwell, now known as Ezekiel Caldwell, was 73 but still sharp of mind and utterly unrepentant. His wife, Martha, along with Josiah, Caleb, and Rebecca, had all maintained their roles in the scheme, perfecting their methods as they went. During questioning, they described in chilling detail how they chose victims, gained the trust of communities, and erased evidence. What was most horrifying was their pride. They spoke of their killings as though they were accomplishments in a successful trade. Justice came swiftly. Ezekiel was hanged in Salem, Oregon, in December 1847. Martha and Josiah followed him to the gallows soon after. Caleb was sentenced to life in prison, where pneumonia claimed him in 1852. Rebecca, the youngest, insisted she had been coerced and received 20 years. But she too perished behind bars in 1851 under unclear circumstances. The revelations stunned towns across the nation where the family had once operated. Families realized that the people they had trusted with their dead had been predators all along. The case became a warning about the perils of blind trust, no matter how respectable someone appeared. Now in his 70s, Dr. Harrison traveled to Oregon to witness Ezekiel's execution and finally confront the man who had haunted his thoughts for decades. Their final meeting was brief but unsettling. Hartwell admitted his surprise that Harrison had survived Millbrook, remarking that other investigators had not been as fortunate. Before his death, he revealed one last dreadful secret, that he and his family had trained apprentices who carried on similar practices elsewhere in the expanding nation. He gave no names or locations, leaving Harrison with the knowledge that the evil he had uncovered might still be spreading. Milbrook itself never healed. Families abandoned the area, unwilling to live under the shadow of betrayal and blood. By 1860, the town was deserted, its buildings slowly swallowed by the forest. With time, official reports slipped into forgotten archives, newspapers faded by into obscurity, and communities erased all memory of the Hartwells. Yet for those who study the darker corners of American history, the Hartwell case endures as a grim reminder. Wickedness can thrive in plain sight, shielded by respectability, pay, and trust. Their story demonstrates how killers could operate undetected in an era before modern law enforcement and communication, and how they weaponized the very faith that once held communities together. Most of all, it proves that ordinary people, whether doctors, neighbors, or friends, can uncover terrible truths, but only if they dare to question appearances. In his later years, Dr. Harrison dedicated himself to recording every detail he had uncovered about the Hartwell affair, believing that his work might one day guide future investigators in recognizing similar patterns of hidden crime. He passed away in 1853, taking to the grave first-hand knowledge of one of the nation's most chilling family-run criminal enterprises. After his death, his carefully kept notes were discovered among his belongings and eventually placed in federal archives, where they remain as a haunting record of deeds that horrified even the officials who exposed them. The Hartwell family's legacy reached far beyond the people they murdered. Their actions undermined the foundation of small-town life, eroding the sense of safety that had allowed neighbors to live as extended families. Where there had once been trust, they left suspicion. Where innocence had once thrived, they planted lasting unease. In this way, their influence stretched beyond individual tragedies, seeping into the very structure of community life across a growing America. Their story is a chilling reminder of how evil can cloak itself in respectability, and how the very institutions meant to comfort us in our moments of grief can sometimes conceal our deepest nightmares. Do you think every truth about the Hartwell family's crimes was brought to light? Or might some darker secrets have been buried forever with them? Share your thoughts below and let us know if history in your part of the world holds similar tales. If you found this story compelling and want more accounts of historical horrors, don't forget to subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this with someone who loves dark mysteries. The past is filled with secrets, and together we'll keep uncovering them. See you in the next episode.